if this is a market characterized by systemic confirmation bias, there are nonetheless some intriguing instances of how our market participants actually saw what was happening around them that suggests a little complicated. The story's a little more complicated. If you turn to the reading and you turn to the table 9 in the article, I believe it is, we see two questions there that the authors posed to their home buyers. The first question says, basically, have you been influenced by all the hype around the housing market? All these media reports, all these anecdotal stories, all of this sort of stuff that's around you is telling you housing is a great place, you should be buying, everybody's making money, and so on. There's all this hype. Have you been influenced by that hype? And about a third of people, give or take, say, yeah, maybe. But most people say, no, I'm not particularly influenced by that. Next question. Can you stop talking about your desire to buy a house? Is basically the question that's asked, right? And then they have two answers. They have the honest answer, no. And then they have the dishonest answer that people saying sometimes, right? So how often do you speak about buying your house? Honest answer, always. Those of you who bought a house know that this is true, right? Because, and it makes sense. This is the most important decision, the most important purchase of your life. So before you actually commit to it, what are you talking about all the time to anyone who will listen? The most important purchase of your life, right? So at dinner parties, to your friends, to your mom, all the time, my house, this, I saw a house yesterday, it was this, I'm looking for that, etc., 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 etc. So always or sometimes. The percentage of respondents who conceded that they couldn't stop talking about their desire to buy a house is what percentage? Between 80 and 90%. The vast majority of people admit that they can't stop talking about the desire to buy a house. Put those two together, and what you see is, are you contributing to the hype around the market? Yes. Are you influenced by the hype that you are creating? No. Next table, table 10. One of the questions says, there have been reports of people lining up to open houses, putting money down, basically no questions asked. What describes this kind of behavior in your market? And they give them two choices. The first choice is essentially an information asymmetry, which is to say that the person who's put it on the market doesn't really know the true value, and so therefore you have savvy buyers who are rushing in to take advantage of what's essentially an asset being sold at a discount, option one. Or, no, people are panicking. In other words, it's an example of panic behavior. Our respondents overwhelmingly agree that when you see that kind of behavior, what you're seeing is panic, right? That's actually about the psychology of the market. Next question. Which best describes the market? Market psychology. Nope. Then you give them one that sounds like math. Demographics, income, interest rates. Oh yeah, that sounds all edumacated. I'm going to go for that one. Sure, it's that one. That's what defines the environment of the market. So, when you look around and you see this behavior in the market in which you bought, what describes it? Market psychology. What describes the market in which you bought? The math. There's a term in psychology that we use to describe the emotional state created by holding two mutually exclusive, contradictory ideas in your head at the same time. Does anyone know what that term is? Cognitive dissonance. You've probably heard the term cognitive dissonance before. Those questions, the answers to those questions are a great example of cognitive dissonance, right? On the part of our market respondents. There's all this hype. Are you influenced by it? Nope, not me, that's somebody else. By the way, are you contributing to the hype? Oh yeah. Then what do you see when you look at these kinds of behavior in the market? I see all this psychology, I see all this panic. What describes your theory of the market? Oh no, it's all about the math. It's not about the psychology. The market's very, very rational. It's a cognitively dissonant market. Perhaps one of the definitions of a bubble is a market which is characterized by its cognitive dissonance. It should give us pause when we see this. But it suggests, right, that the people who were buying did have access to information that was inconsistent with their own reading of their purchase. People sort of knew that something was going on here, and yet they chose not to include it as part of their sort of informational sphere. They chose not to include that part. So they exempted themselves from from the implications that that might suggest. Why did they do such a thing? Are we just irrational? Is that what we should take away? Is economics wrong? We're not rational agents, we're irrational agents?
You see a lot in asset bubbles, what's called the greater fool theory.
Yeah, last fool in.
Yeah, the concept that even though I know it's overpriced, I'll find somebody who's a bigger fool than I am to buy it at an even higher price in the future.
Do you think that the market participants, based on the survey that we saw, that they thought that these assets were unfairly priced? I think they thought, in fact, that that expectation of future price appreciation indicates that they thought they were buying at a kind of a fair market value. I'm going to suggest this. This is how we resolve the question of the cognitively dissonant market, is that people were able to construct for themselves essentially a kind of story that resolved or that worked out the contradictions that people were seeing. And the argument I'm going to make for that is also in one of the tables, table 11. You can see the kinds of stories that coalesce around this issue. Table 11 contains a very unusual finding, in my view. There are some distressing findings, like, for example, almost nobody used any kind of quantitative approach whatsoever when committing hundreds of thousands of dollars to their own money to the purchase. That should distress us a little bit, that social understanding of economics is so low that essentially nobody used basic metrics. But there's something strange, not distressing, just strange in this table. Who noticed something in this table that they couldn't explain? San Francisco.
The Asian investors?
1988, Asian investors. Think about that for a moment. 1988, San Francisco. When you were walking the streets of San Francisco in 1988, asking San Franciscans about their housing market, 4 out of 10 would have told you it's the Asians. And you're like, really? Yes, Asians. Why Asians? First of all, by Asians, who do they mean? Japanese, right? They mean the Japanese. What's going on in San Francisco 1988? The Japanese, Asian investors, Asian immigrants should be identified as such a determinant characteristic of that market. What does Japan look like in the late 1980s? What's the word that we would use to describe Japan in the late 1980s? Bubble. Huge, epic bubble. They're still recovering from the bubble. The last 2-3 decades, I guess not quite that long, 2.5 decades, it's been a very long, painful recovery from one of the most epic bubbles of all time. That's why Japan has the highest level of debt to GDP. They've quantitatively eased, or tried quantitatively to ease their way out of their problems for 2 decades by keeping borrowing costs essentially at zero. Hasn't worked. Why? The trauma of the bubble in the 1980s was so great, it's probably going to take a generational shift for people to move beyond that event. Prices in Japan. So what's the story going on here is that over the 1980s, right, we see the revival, this enormous revival of the Japanese economy. The yen doubles in value over the course of the decade. Prices in Japan become very, very inflated. I believe that in the late 1980s in many Japanese cities, you could get a 100-year mortgage. A 100-year mortgage. That's a mortgage for you, for your children, for their children. People who've never met you are still paying off your mortgage for like a 20-meter flat somewhere in downtown Tokyo. He's like, who was this guy who thought that this was a good idea? And so that meant, in an environment of those kinds of inflated asset prices, it meant that rent-seeking capital, cash, was looking for fair value elsewhere. And so you saw a lot of outflows, capital outflows from Japan looking for investments abroad. One of the places that Japanese capital flowed to was the United States. You can, if you're interested, there's a movie that sort of is based on the backdrop of that called Rising Sun, which features Wesley Snipes and Sean Connery. The quality of the movie I will not comment upon. But the villain in the movie is a cartoonishly evil Japanese businessman who's come over to buy up US assets and do bad things to them. I mean, that's the sort of national backdrop here, so that people understand, there's a kind of a general understanding that all this Japanese capital is coming into the United States, and so on. So this is certainly out there as an idea. And yet it's only in San Francisco where 4 out of 10 people, when asked to identify what are the factors that are holding up, making your market buoyant. Because remember, 1988, we're looking at, again, another housing bubble across many cities in the United States. San Francisco was one of them. When San Franciscans were asked, why only in San Francisco? Was the answer, it's the Japanese. Why not LA, Boston? What's going on? How might we explain that? Well, the question we might ask is, what US city has the largest Japanese American population? Honolulu. What American city has the second largest Japanese population? New York. What city has the third? No, I'm kidding. Second, third, somewhere around that. San Francisco is a city very characterized by a Japanese American culture, right? From the turn of the century, a lot of Japanese Americans settled in San Francisco. So there is, it seems, a kind of cultural predisposition in San Francisco as a result of their particular circumstances to take what's this sort of larger national context and have it coalesce into what's basically a local story. Real estate is local, right? Why is the house on this street next to that school, close to this park? Why is it going to retain its value? That local story in San Francisco tapped into this larger story and made it a local, the word I would use is narrative. That was the story that San Franciscans were telling themselves about their market. Boston, LA, who knows? But in San Francisco, if you want to understand why prices are high and will stay high, Japanese. Who knows how it started? Maybe it was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle. Japanese investors love San Francisco for the fresh sushi. Who you don't know. Maybe there was some kind of word of mouth that spread around. But at some point, that idea coalesced and became the local story that San Franciscans told themselves. Once they had told themselves that story, became true. And that's why we see it on the survey, 4 out of 10 responding voluntarily about the local conditions in 1988. That was the story that San Franciscans were telling themselves about their market. Was it true? No. Did it support their market? No. Did housing prices collapse in San Francisco? Yes. But it was a good story to tell yourself while it lasted.